A very good evening to everybody and a very warm welcome also. I'm Meenakshi Upadhyay Sharma, and on behalf of the Lucknow Expression Society, I welcome all of you to the second online spring session of the Metaphor Lucknow Literature Festival. The inauguration ceremony of the eighth edition of the Metaphor was held day before yesterday at the University of Lucknow. The festival otherwise would have been actually a 3-day event where our celebrated guests could have interacted live with the audience. But due to the COVID pandemic, the society had to make do with the best options available. And as such, the program is now being extended to 7 evenings, wherein all the interactions will be online starting today. Welcoming all of you to the second online session of the spring session of the spring season of the Metaphor, and that is the Lucknow Literature Festival. We had a wonderful session yesterday, decoding the myths with Amish Tripathi and Bhavna Roy. The recordings are available on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. And coming to today's session is called as The Architecture of Storytelling. And let me tell you a little bit about it. Now, you must be wondering why we call that, why we have named our session as The Architecture of Storytelling. So while storytelling is primarily the intention of books and films, architecture is what gives the stories its context. The setting within the stories are played out. While books leave the architectural context largely to the imagination of the reader, cinema has to place the scenes in time to be enacted in the context of specific architectural backdrop that depict the time or the times that the story is set in. This interesting presentation by architect Snehanshu Mukhjerjee, to be followed by a discussion between him and architect Srinivas Murthy, now looks at how architecture helps to give a physical dimension and shape, add a dimension of time convincingly to the written works of fiction as depicted in cinema by exploring specific scenes from classic films like Satyajit Ray's Aparajito, Charulata, and Akira Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, amongst others. Our panelists for today are Srinivas Murthy in conversation with Snehanshu Mukhjerjee, and let us get to know our panelists a little bit. Now, Mr. Snehanshu Mukhjerjee is an architect educated at the famous SPA New Delhi and the MIT USA. He's the founding partner of Team, that's a firm that was established over 30 years ago and is based in New Delhi. He has been the architect for projects such as the National Gallery of Modern Art, New Delhi, Embassy of Spain in India, and the Oshadham. He has also been involved in research and teaching throughout his professional career and has taught at institutes such as the SPA New Delhi, the CEPT Ahmedabad, the PVCOA Pune, and he continues to work as an architect while currently teaching as adjunct professor at the Indian Institute of Art and Design, New Delhi. But there's more to him. Mr. Mukherjee is an architect who wanted to be a cinematographer. He joined SPA, that is the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi in 1977 to become an architect. But during his third year at the SPA, he, along with his friend Anurag Gupta, made an abstract black and white film based upon an excerpt from Igor Stravinsky's ballet, The Rites of Spring. Anurag and Snehanshu later in 1986 went on to make several commercial spots for LML Vespa, which were aired on Doordarshan. He had also curated an exhibition with Satyajit Ray held in the Oxford Bookstore in Kolkata. On the art of Satyajit Ray, Snehanshu has designed sets for several plays of Abhiyan and Natikal in New Delhi. Along with teaching and practicing architecture, he has remained a keen observer of the performing arts. And now, for our second panelist, Srinivas Murthy, a leading architecture and design consultant with a worldwide arena of professional engagement, is the founder and principal architect of a studio named SMG Design Inc. Since its inception, it has achieved many remarkable milestones, both in professional practice and academic initiatives worldwide in the field of architecture, design, research, design documentation, and filmmaking. Srinivas Murthy graduated with distinction from the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. In 1991, SMG Design Inc. has undertaken many prestigious projects in the field of medical and healthcare, museum design, tourism, corporate and IT infrastructure, master planning of large townships, and academic campuses. He's popularly also known as SMG, and he's the founding board member of the World Association of Architecture of Organizations, and he's the founding president of Architecture and Indian Design Foundation. He was awarded the Award for Excellence 2017 by the government of Telangana for a year-long program of architecture for social equity heritage walks for school children. He was conferred the Fellow of IGBC Award by IGBC in 2019. So that was a formidable introduction of both our panelists for today.
Good evening, friends. And Snehanshu, thank you so much for such an interesting and, really engrossing presentation. Many thoughts keep coming across, and there are millions of issues and questions that are there, at least in my mind. So I'm just requesting our host to keep a watch on the chat box. I'm sure there are many audience out there who are having couple of questions for you. And to get the whole process going, I thought, why not I start with my own set of questions, some issues that we can talk about. Since interestingly, it's a conversation between two architects, I would say, to begin with. So maybe there will be a heavy dose of, architectural, inclination, I would say, in that sense. But at the same time, I would also like to confess here that I have been a great movie buff, and I also did a course in cinematography. So that's how I got interested in this topic. So I would like to begin with asking you that how did you get into, interested in this topic? I mean, why did you think of doing a story like this?
So the truth is that, I actually wanted to be a cinematographer before I thought of being an architect. But in those days, it was not looked upon as a very good profession. So my mother specifically said, no, nothing doing. You're not going to go to Pune. And therefore, I chose architecture, which was my next preferred profession. And it's during those days that, as you heard by the introduction by Meenakshi, that I made this film with Anurag, and subsequently made several films because, I tried every opportunity to start shooting whenever I could. But this particular talk I thought of because I found that uncanny similarity between the way we design and a way a movie is created, right from the time of writing the script and the shots. And that's what I tried to explain through the talk by those various examples, especially from the works of Ray.
That's so interesting because, as it happened that I come from the same school as you come from, and Anurag is somebody whom I also know, and I was probably introduced to him by you. So I also started my career actually as a, kind of an assistant producer or director or whatever, a filmmaking exercise which Anurag and me did for Hutco. And that I remember that film was called Making Better Homes. And I think it was to try and promote the alternative and more appropriate way of building, especially in the poor housing. So that, there's something common between two of us. So coming back to this presentation, Snehanshu, I wanted to check that, many places you have mentioned this fact that, the music or the dialogues which are written and said, and they communicate a certain kind of a mood or an idea in a film, right? Yeah. And these have an instantaneous impact on the audience who is watching, right? When you shout in a louder, if let's say you are showing an aggressive scene or there is a sad scene and you are seated in your seat in the auditorium, you really get impacted immediately.
Yeah.
But what happens to architecture in that sense? Does architecture have an immediate impact on the person who visits or who uses or who just even passes by it?
So that's a very interesting question because To be honest, I've not thought of it that way. But now that you ask me this question, I would say that, yes, there are buildings which does that to you. But they are very few that you come across in your daily routine. And I think it is to do with the quality of that architecture that can do this to you. So I remember in my first year in college, we were taken to see Fatehpur Sikri, and that was quite a revelation. I had never been to Fatehpur Sikri before that, and the whole complex and each and every building there was amazing. It sort of transported you to a different time. So yes, architecture does have that quality, but it's a more difficult thing to feel because in a cinema hall, you're in the dark, you are caught in your seat, you're pretty much like a puppet in the hands of the director. You don't leave unless it's a really bad film. So, the impact of the film is therefore tailored towards each member of the audience. But in architecture, there's so many distractions. The climate can be awful. It could be very hot, for instance, and you're not really appreciating what you're seeing. But yet there are buildings or there are complexes, works by great architects, some of them we don't even know about, who can move you, even in adverse conditions. So yes, it happens.
So would you agree with the idea that cinema could have an impact which happens probably in a couple of minutes or seconds, but that impact could stay for you for life? It could be more spiritual or intellectual in nature, that impact, whereas architecture's impact is more physical, whether you like it or not. Sometimes you cannot avoid it. Yeah. And that is why we keep saying that, each piece of creation in architecture impacts the whole, humanity in a way which you can imagine about it. So I guess that's what you meant to say. So again, another thing which I wanted to, from your text, which you read about your presentation, you said that there is a, difference between what an author writes the story about, okay, what was his intention, then director interprets it probably in the same way or sometimes even in a different way or his own way, if not different way, but his own way, and tries to portray that story in a cinematographic way. Does this same thing apply to architecture? Because I thought, in my opinion, architects tend to understand what the user or the owner or people would like to have, and then he tries to deliver. Whereas in a cinematic exercise, you want to say and impress upon people and mold them the way you would like them to look at it. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, well, yes, architects definitely talk to their users, or if there is no specific user, one tries to create a program by which you understand the function of the building and how it should be used. But the way the building is designed and it's finally built controls the lives of the people who use it, whether they're outside or inside. And that is why, and that is a permanent thing. You see, in the case of cinema or movies or art or literature, you can read a book, you can watch that film, and if it remains in your memory, it's in your memory. But buildings are there physically. It might be a school that you go to as a child, and if it's not a very well done building, you may not realize it, but it's going to affect your life, So it's, in a way, architects have a much bigger responsibility towards creating the built environment.
And why did you say that, when you get into a cinema theater, that's the end of the imagination of the viewer? I particularly like that few words because then, the viewer is literally forced into, becoming part of the whole cinematographic exercise. Whereas in architecture, I don't think that really happens in that capacity. So is there a scope in both? How would you like to analyze it? How does viewer's point of view can differ from the ones which is from, let's say, director's point of view? And in the same way, how a user's point of view could differ from what architects had envisioned about the particular building or the space?
Yeah, actually, that's a very close parallel because you may have read the book. So here we are talking about cinema which has been made usually from a book. All my examples have been deliberately chosen from literature. So you may have read the book and then you see the film and the two don't match. It may not match in the sense that you don't like it, or it can match in a way or doesn't match in a way that it's greater than what you imagined it to be. So when you read the book, you had a certain idea about what the story is and how it's unfolding. But directors, and especially somebody like Satyajit Ray, can take that same story and make it, something amazing. So the same happens with architects. So you can be designing a school. I mean, anybody can be designing a school, and there are schools and schools, as we know. Some schools are remarkable. The way the whole building unfolds as you move through it is something that maybe doesn't happen in a whole lot of other schools. And this, again, is the power of the architect, same as the power of the director. And similarly, the building can be quite an ordeal for the user. And they are then cursing the architect every day. That also happens. So it's similar in that sense. There are parallels between the two.
Now that you mentioned about Satyajit Ray, and so I just very curious to know, I mean, why would he draw his settings so much in detail? Why would he not hire an architect, let's say, to begin with? Number one. Number two would be that instead of drawing and trying to figure out the set and make it again, why would he not shoot in the actual locations?
Yeah. So to answer why he didn't hire an architect, well, he may have consulted, I don't know. But you see, he had initially hired Bansi Chandragupta as the art director. A lot of his earlier films were, created by Bansi Chandragupta in terms of settings. But as Ray kept improving or kept learning through his own experience, he started doing many things which very few directors in this world are capable of. So initially, the three Apu trilogies were done by, music was done by Ravi Shankar, your guru, Srinivas. And then later, Ray moved into his own compositions. And similarly, Bansi Chandragupta, Ray moved into his own art direction. He always had the name of a camera person, a cameraman, or a cinematographer, but everybody knows that he controlled the camera in the end. Similarly, he always had the name of Dulal Datta as the editor, but everybody knows that he did the entire editing on the... So now, so Ray is a true Renaissance man. He's a man who did so many things and did them equally well. Not everybody can do it. So therefore, he's very special. Now, regarding the second question, just remind me what it was exactly.
Why would he not shoot, let's say, an actual location?
On location all the time, yeah. So there are two reasons, really. And one of the reasons was there in the talk, which I'll repeat. One reason is that the location may not be right, in the sense that he may not have found the correct location. There may be too many problems with the location, even if he found it. For instance, background noise. Of course, you can dub it. But it can be so many things. For instance, I believe in the shooting of Shatranj Ke Khiladi, the last scene where the two friends are going to play chess out in the field, he had a tough time locating a spot near Lucknow. In fact, that is a film which is based in Lucknow. Which did not have telegraph lines, or it didn't have electrical lines in the skyline. So he had a very tough time. So that tells you that, location always is not easy to find. That's one. But there is another reason, which Mari Seton talks about. That, the set of the veranda, so they made 2 out of 3 sets, that the way they had thought of it. And the reason is that the camera position is critical for any cinema. And if you were to shoot on location, there are many things the camera can't do. And in fact, if you remember the scene from Charulata, in the end, the heroine, Madhavi Chakraborty, comes in and is opening, before she opens the bookcase to put the book back, the camera is actually sitting inside the wall. Now, that's not going to be possible in a real location at all. So I think that is one of the chief reasons that a set has to be made. And also, you have much better control over everything inside a studio, right? From lighting to sound to just about everything, It's much better to work there. That's the reason.
I know. I cannot agree more than this. I mean, he was definitely a brilliant cinematographer and a filmmaker, and I'm sure he would have made a great architect if he had chosen to practice architecture.
Yes.
So we have. So now that since you talked about sets, there's a very interesting question from one of the audience, which says that which movie would you say brought about a turning point in set development for Indian films?
Oh, difficult question. You see, now the problem with that answer is going to be something like this. You see, Indian films are used to be categorized into three types. So you had the mainstream, you had the avant-garde, which is the so-called art film, and then you had the crossover films that were sort of in between. So I would say that the mainstream didn't pay too much attention to set design. Or let's say, not even that, I would say didn't pay too much attention to the authenticity of a location in a set. To name a classic example is Pakiza. Now, Pakiza is such a famous film and is an all-time super hit. But the sets, if you see it, are not really what you expect as the location. And especially it becomes even more stark because there are certain scenes in Pakiza which are shot on location. So the two don't match in any way, you know. So the famous Chalte Chalte song scene is in studio, which is like, you know, over the top. And then there are scenes where Meena Kumari is going into the graveyard or is going on a tanga, which is reality. And there is a big contrast. So, you know, so I don't know in the sense of mainstream when it was that it became authentic. But in the case of parallel cinema, many films. And Ray, of course, is a pioneer. And I would say just before him, it was probably Bimal Roy. He did mainstream cinema, but he didn't really classify as the Pakiza variety. They were far more serious and far more authentic in the location. So I don't know if I've been able to answer this question well, but yes, Bimal Roy. And even before that, I would say Shorab Modi. Shorab Modi in Sikandar, or in, I think there was another film which he shot extensively in Agra Fort and Fatehpur Sikri. The name escapes me, but I've seen it. No, I can't remember it just now. So you know, there are people who have actually done sets quite seriously, even in mainstream.
I think this conversation is really getting very interesting. So we have one more questions from the audience, again related to set. It says that, except for Ray, which director in India or across the globe would you ask a young set designer or a filmmaker to study or follow?
Oh, you see, I must confess, I'm not such an authority on filmmaking, but you would realize, I would say a lot of the foreign films, whether they're Japanese or American or British, they're all very well done in terms of sets. And in India today, we have some very good sets. So like Maqbool that you saw a little bit of has very authentic sets. So it's very difficult to, you know, say who is good. So I recently attended, during this lockdown, I attended a talk that my college had organized on the art direction, or rather production controller of Bomkesh Bakshi. This is this set in Calcutta during the war. Who is it? The director's name is, he's a Delhi-based, I mean, he was in Delhi actually, and very where I used to stay earlier, Dibakar Banerjee. So he's the director. And the production controller is actually a graduate of National Institute of Design. And she, now again, I'm bad with names these days, I've got too old. So the name escapes me, but she showed how she actually worked towards putting together the sets and all the things in the production. To the dresses and the matchboxes and everything. So in cinema, I find cinema to be a very difficult thing to do because you have to look at every little thing. And that's the production controller. So we actually have very good people in India, especially. I think the technical side, which production control is part of, is excellent. And the directors who can make use of it are, intelligent people. And there are, of course, directors who don't make use of it anymore. But I think over the years, today, especially if you see films like Kesari and what is that?
Even a film, I don't know if you have seen the mega successful film Bahubali. I mean, the sets are amazing, yes. And which was a production from the South.
Yes,
and so I think, that brings me back to my own set of questions and observation is that when we are talking about sets and all that, where do you see this whole idea of, digitally aided visualization coming into picture now? And does that take away anything from the original process of imagination or being true or honest to the whole creative process? Or I'm sure many of us would also like to argue that whether digital medium is only a tool to implement your creativity in a sense, but has it taken away anything which we would like to talk about?
Well, I could equate it a little bit with the way we as architects practice with the digital medium. Today, the digital medium is become more cinematic for architects, as you know. Walkthroughs, we do animations, 3D animations, we do all these, stunning 3D renders. Now, when I say we as architects rarely do it. We have people who are technically qualified who do that. So, but what we have to do is to create the right architecture and then guide those technically qualified people to be able to generate that image. So what it is doing is that it is making it more photorealistic. It is more and more real. The same, I think, is happening with films, because you see, to make a film, like for instance, the first Star Wars that was made introduced the blue screen for the first time, in which the actors had to act in front of a blue screen. So I think it's incredibly tough for the actors because there are no props. So that famous laser fight with the Darth Vader, is that they don't actually have that. That was in those days actually frame by frame, hand painted. Now all today is done totally digitally. For the actor, it's still tough, I think. I'm not sure. I've never acted in such a situation. But it's very difficult to act in front of a set that doesn't exist, and maybe even hold props that don't really exist. What it has done is, I think, reduce the cost and the time of filmmaking immensely. Because there are these armies of people who are digitally creating, and it's so easy to tweak it, as we all know. Once you've made the 3D model in architecture, you can make your changes, very quickly, and you can actually test. But for us, for both Srinivas and me, who are old school, we have, I think, this inherent dislike for it, though we accept it because that's what we have to do today. And the reason for the dislike is not just being parochial, it's not about being old-fashioned, but it's the fact that, the real model, as we used to make in college or later on in office, was a model that you could hold up in your hand and see. It was three-dimensional. So I think cinema doesn't matter too much because cinema is rarely three-dimensional.
And of course, I would say that somewhere we are, also compromising with a particular craft which was so well nourished and, in the past. Of course, now in the age of digitalization, a new skill set is coming forward, new people who have expertise in this. So having said that, I will take you on with the frames which you mentioned. I remember you said frame is very critical in a movie, right? In a cinema. And the whole cinematic process is actually, typically visualized frame by frame, how it moves. Would you like to draw any parallel between that frame by frame visualization in cinema versus architecture? Do we really visualize it that way? Or another way, which I would say my observation would be that cinematography is all about intellectual, creative and emotional, journey or conveying a thought or an idea. Whereas in architecture, there is physicality and there is life-lasting impact on the lives and users of the particular space. So I just wanted to hear from you, what do you think about these two, frame by frame visualization in cinema versus architecture?
Yeah, so yes, so in cinema, as you very rightly said, it's the director's eye that is showing you every scene and unfolding the story. What happens in architecture, I think, is that it's the user's eye. So the user becomes the director, and it's how he or she sees the place and the way he or she walks through it and experiences it over the seasons and the day and night cycle. and the real life, the drama of real life unfolding in that space. So yes, there are similarities. And I don't know if every architect does it, but I do know of architects. And I think Srinivas is one architect like that. And I am one such architect who try to design by imagining how the building is as we move through it. So after you've created the basic plan, which now works as a basic sketch plan, we immediately try to imagine how the person experiences those spaces. And that is how you put together the building. Otherwise, it's just a plan, and the plan doesn't really make the building. There are many things beyond just the plan. Whereas most emphasis is given on the plan by whoever who has to build it or understand what it is. But that is something that is hidden. Actually, the plan is never seen till the time the building is brought down and you see the plinth. And what you see is really the spaces and your journey through the space.
So I would like to, hit upon two questions I have, which are, in my opinion, very interesting to talk about. One, when you talked about the whole user becoming the director, but what I'm also trying to understand here is that when a person sits in that seat in a cinema hall, and he's watching a movie. So let's imagine that there is a war going on in a desert. You are actually transported to that desert scene. You feel very hot, maybe you feel agitated, you feel anger or something like that. But then after those 2.5 hours of movie, you come out, you're actually completely in a different world. I mean, your transportation from one part of life to another one is so stark and so immediate, which I am trying to understand that what parallels could we look at in architecture, because architecture in that sense is more continuous, it is more long lasting. So that was one thing which I thought I would ask you. How do you view that kind of a stark difference of opinion or the way to look at things?
Yeah, so yes, so it does happen again, but it happens with exceptional works of architecture, I would say. And, so again, I would give an example from, again, that same first year visit to Agra. And it was somewhere around 1 PM. And we were all very hungry. And Professor Jhabwala took us all to see the Taj. And again, I had never seen the Taj before. Of course, one had seen lots of pictures of it. And one knew what to expect. So I was sort of, not too impressed by the fact that we were going to the Taj. And you walk through, as most of you may have gone to the Taj, and you would have realized that you walk through a lot of commotion and, disturbances all around. And then from the time you start from the gate, the main gate, and that's where Professor Jhabwala made us pause, all you realize, actually, you start from the gate behind, which used to be the main complex where the workers stay. From there, you realize that you don't see the Taj. And you have to walk in a sequence. And the first entry, the first glimpse of the Taj is so spellbinding that despite the heat, despite the hunger, despite the fact that, Taj is a cliche, everybody knows that it's supposed to be one of the wonders of the world. Somebody who's then just about, 17, 18 is silenced, So that does happen with architecture as well. But it has to be exceptional works of architecture. But that's true for even films. Yes, as long as you're within a hall, whatever that film is, you may be fidgeting, but you want to stay till the end. And then you may come out and forget all about it. But if the film is something that leaves a mark, it haunts you forever, even after you left the hall and moved into different surroundings.
So I will come back to that. My question was about does film age, but I will come to that later. But my immediate question is that, in my opinion, both the films and the profession of architecture, in a way, is alien to Indian civilization, or let's say Indian culture in many ways, right? Because we were more about street plays and notankis and, many of that visual thing, and which finally we adopted this a stream of expression in a very beautiful way. And so was architecture in a very different way. I would say the whole profession of architecture, I'm not talking about craft of architecture, but profession of architecture is a very Western notion where you get trained to design a building and then you come back and design for somebody else. So my observation is, I would like to hear from you on this, is that we have adopted this whole medium of cinema so beautifully. And in fact, we have excelled as good as, let's say, Hollywood filmmakers. And we have been able to retain our own distinct style, character, without really compromising on our, let us say, a larger cultural or, let's say, value system. I mean, though there are debates about what we show in the movies is not really, and there are arguments in favor also saying that cinema depicts what the society is all about. Okay, especially when we talk about issues related to women and, the atrocities and the, crime and all that. But in architecture, I feel that unfortunately we have moved away from our own base, our own tradition, our own culture, especially when I talk about architecture being a craft in India rather than a profession in India. Why do you think it has happened?
So, Srinivas, the way to understand is, as you very rightly said, the way architecture is taught is an alien way of teaching architecture. And it has deliberately, because of this whole notion of modernism, it has deliberately neglected the traditional Indian ways of working, especially for architects, where it was more of a collaborative effect or effort, rather than one architect, who's like the supreme person who is controlling everything right down to the last bolt being put into the building. So that's a great pity. Now, but even within this way of creating architecture, buildings that we are getting increasingly today, not so much in the past, are complete mimicries of a style, really, than architecture. It's a style which is largely glass-clad, and it comes from the West. It has now become the corporate symbol the world over. So whether you're in Dubai or Shanghai, whether your geography suits that sort of building or not, that is what is being pushed more and more. Because I think it could also be because we are not sure of our own identity. And that's the case with the Chinese as well, I would say. Despite being one of the biggest economies going, they seem to be very sure of their identity as a cultural entity, whereas Chinese civilization is almost as old as Indian civilization. And, this problem is there everywhere. So, yes, I agree with you on that. And it's a great pity. And there's still time to reverse it, if only people wake up to it.
So coming back to, again, Ray's films, and when we talked about, actually this whole presentation, we thought of discussing literature, cinema, and architecture. And I'm just quoting here what Mr. Ray had written, that the place that is Benares, the architectural space or the setting that is so special to this famous city is what gives a special meaning to the scene. I mean, he says that. So you feel somewhere finally architecture is taking over?
Again, Benares is from the past. And yes, architecture is taking over, whether it is for good or the worse. Now, I can give you an example of some very, remarkable work of architecture in Nazi Germany. And, I guess some of you in the audience, and maybe Srinivas, you yourself, know about this. Like Albert Speer was a complete Nazi, also an architect. Yeah. He was Hitler's right-hand man. And the famous Nuremberg rally, which there are lots of photographs of that you can see on the internet, right, it's a very powerful work of architecture, but for the wrong reasons. This is an example of extreme fascism. And it's very effective, it's very seductive. I can imagine how it might have felt for all those people, arranged on the field, and then there is this set of steps and a huge monument with the arc lights going up into the sky, and it's highly dramatic. So the point is that architecture can be made to serve different ends, just like literature can be. And a quote by Carr, where he talks about the fact that if you fictionalize history, you are writing either historic fiction or you're writing propaganda. So, that is true for architecture as well. And it's true for literature, it's true for films. The three things that we are discussing, it is true for all of them. And at the same time, so it's like this, that no medium is wrong by itself. It's what you do with it. And what you create is either good or not so good.
So coming to, so since you mentioned about this whole idea of transformation somewhere, how the lights and other things, I know I have that film with me, which is called Architects of the Doom, which talks about, Hitler and his work. And he himself was supposed to be a great artist in that sense. He had training in visualization. And many people say that he actually visualized his parades, how he would like big flags to come, what he would like to see and all that. But moving away from that aspect of, thing, so do architecture, we say that there is timelessness in architecture, but in cinematography, in a cinematographic work or a literary work or even a musical composition, there is that concept, so do they really age in that sense?
I would say, yes, that's a very interesting question. I've also thought about it many times, but no, I don't think it ages. You may, at the back of your mind, remember when that composition was sung, or when the building was made, or when the movie was made. But when you see it or hear it or read that book, it's timeless. There is no age that defines it. So, yeah, I mean, that's very much the case. I mean, we know of famous classical singers who are now no more, who have sung these songs in 1930s, 20s, recordings even. But when you hear that song, it supports, whether it is D.V.
Okay, so this concept could be, when we talk about aging, maybe we are looking at a time span of a lifetime. But what about momentary transformations? In that sense, what happens to the age? I mean, I feel in architecture, there is that element of momentary transformation. Whereas if I have watched Sholay 30 years ago, and if I watch it today, to me, the film is still the same. Yeah. But in a building or in a space, that transformation is quite, I would say, fast, and it's momentary sometimes, depending on. So how do you look at that in that sense of aging or retaining its, let's say, beauty to experience?
So yes, that I have seen myself with some of my own designs. So I have this thing that whenever I go back to a site that has been built many years ago, I forget that I have designed it. So, I walk in and I'm mostly critical. But the point is that there are parts of that building which makes me forget who has actually designed it or what was the process by which the design was done. In that sense, it is as if it was always like that, And that I think is the quality that every creator strives for, whether it is in fine arts or filmmaking or writing or architecture or singing, music, whatever, to try and attain that. It's not always possible, but it is, if you try, you may reach there. That is the way I think of it.
So like in films, we talk about genre, right? We talk about love stories, we talk about tragedies, we talk about action films. But in architecture, I think this whole idea of genre is quite different. Here we are talking about styles as genre, right? But would you like to draw any parallel from the actual genre of films versus what it could mean in architecture? So how would you, let's say, relate to an idea of tragedy or, love story or an action film into architecture?
Into architecture. Well, that's interesting. Because I remember when we'd gone to Verona, there is this, that's where Romeo and Juliet was supposed to be set. And the guides take you to this particular balcony saying, this is where Juliet used to be. Now, that's a complete fake. There was no scene. Maybe there was a Juliet, there was a Romeo, I don't know. But that balcony is definitely not. But people read meanings into it. I mean, for the ordinary tourist, they look at it with awe and they try to imagine that whole thing happening. So yes, I think it's the stories that are built around the works of architecture that help, to create that impression of what we are trying to design for. The reason why you're designing a building is something that can affect the way you design it, and you want to pass that effect here, the effect that the building will create in the mind of the viewer or the user. You create the building in a manner which affects that person's mind or that person's perception as well. At least that is what I feel most architects should be trying to do, and be conscious of the effect you're trying to create. So if you're building a house, I don't think one should try to make it into a cold, maybe just exposed concrete walls with light streaming in a very dramatic way, and basically make it very uncomfortable for the people who live there. So I mean, it is not going to be the sort of house that I would like to live in, for example. So that's true for any sort of building that you design.
So in a way, you're saying that buildings cannot be canned, whereas films can be canned.
Yes, you have to live with them.
Yeah, but then, maybe we should have another talk where we can talk about this whole concepts called rhythm, contrast,
yes.
Elements like that, which we tend to use in architecture and how they are being used in films. Within the same film, are there elements like this? But that could probably be a very interesting talk to look at it. But now I come back to this, somebody who's asked me a question that, we are talking so much about architecture and cinema and all that. And now we also mentioned examples of Shakespeare's Macbeth, which has been interpreted in so many ways in different countries, different cultures. But somewhere, if you look at it, it's the story which is becoming more important. And architecture technically has taken a backseat. I mean, it is, so whether it is in India or whether it's in Japan or whether it's in Europe, it is the story which is driving, not the architecture. So
absolutely.
It's true. That's true. Okay.
I agree with it. See, the point is that, especially in literature and cinema, architecture doesn't really come in much in literature. When you read a book, you don't imagine the place that much, because usually the writer doesn't describe it fully. Some writers do, and they do it with a lot of economy. They don't use too many words, but they describe it very well. On the other hand, if you take the literature of theater, when you write plays, their architecture becomes very important. The kind of set that you create, or even if you don't create a set, by negating the physical setting, you are still addressing architecture, is what as you heard, I have designed several sets, and I have seen this happening myself. And whereas in cinema, architecture is the setting. Without that, the story doesn't unfold. Just like it doesn't unfold without the actors or the props or the costumes, similarly, it doesn't unfold without the setting, which is why architecture becomes so important in cinema. But when we look at architecture itself, without the connection to stories or cinema, that is to literature or cinema, but architects are constantly designing for a narrative. So we are building our own stories through the design. And that is what I said somewhere in the beginning of the talk. That's the similarity between a director putting together a film and an architect putting together a design to be built finally. So there is that similarity.
But that's very interesting observation, Snehanshu, because then I used to think, I still believe that architecture is deeply rooted in a geographical context. It should be. Whereas a literary work or a musical work or a cinematographic work can't transcend to any planes. It can move from one continent to other continent and still hold its value very much there. Whereas architecture ideally should not hold that value, so to say, if we believe in the real sense of design in a context. So I think we have really covered quite a lot, I would say. And there's one more question which has come up in from the audience, is that when we look at a movie or a literary work, the author is very well recognized there. When you read a book, when you see a film, who's directed it or who's written it. Why is it with architecture that we never come to know who's the author of creation?
Well, I think it's the fault of the architects. We are such a retiring bunch. But I can tell you, there is one city where I have seen myself, the name of the architect on every building, and even on a residential building, a house. And that used to be Brussels. Mm-hmm. Interesting. In Brussels, there's a rule that every building will have at the entrance a piece of stone with the name of the architect and the year it was built carved in there. So, maybe that's what we should also be doing. And that way, you get both. You get the brickbats as well as the bouquets. If you do a bad building, people will talk about it. If you do a good, then also people will talk about it. But okay.
So I would like to end this conversation with another question, which I would, from your last observation, which you made in your presentation, you suddenly bring in this element of history you talk about. So I would like to know, what do you think is your opinion or your thought on history, architecture, India, and education. I know that there are many things that we can talk about it, but with reference to particularly understanding architecture in its totality of a cultural and traditional architectural style and context, what does history have to do in that?
So history is something that is common to all of this, because without history, we don't really have a cultural context. As we speak, what's already been spoken is now history. And I'm just using that as an example. But you see, if we don't understand our own history, we don't know where we belong. And because we are, as modernists, not expected to look at history, that was one of the main agendas of modernism, which, in any case, as we all know, is really the slogan for capitalism and industrialization, whereas all ancient cultures are not from the background of industrialization or capitalism. And fortunately or unfortunately, India has a huge historical lineage, which I think it is our business to try and understand, because that is what is going to help us solve the problems for the future. Because I firmly believe, especially in architecture, that if we understand how people dealt with issues in the past in terms of buildings or cities, we have an answer for a more sustainable future, which this technology-driven age has failed to give us. And we all know that. Look at global warming, look at what is happening. But that's the reason I feel that history is such an important subject. But I don't mean the typical textbook history that is unfortunately taught in schools. I mean history as a knowledge receptacle that you draw from to inform your actions for the future. That's the way I look at history.
So I understand what you're saying, that history need not be looked at as a baggage that we need to carry, as a burden, but we need to really look at it up as a starting point to move ahead. I think that's very interesting. I think with this, we would like to conclude this fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. I think it was very interesting. Many new thoughts and ideas have come forward, and I'm sure our audience would have really loved listening to you and your presentation. As I don't have to say it, I mean, fantastic. It brings out many things which many architects, especially young architects, would like to know about the great works of Satyajit Ray and Kurosawa and all that. So thank you, Snehanshu, so much for your time and making this presentation. And I think on behalf of both of us, I would like to thank the Metaphor LitFest, which is organized by the Lucknow Literary Society. It has been indeed a pleasure, and I really wish it would have been, if it had been a live presentation and if there was audience around us, it would have been even more livelier and more engaging in that sense. But nonetheless, I sincerely hope the audience have enjoyed. And if there are many more queries, they can write back to the Literary Society of Lucknow, and both of us would be happy to probably reply back to each one of you. So thank you so much, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Srinivas, for asking all those fantastic questions. I'm so glad you were there as the panel. And of course, thank you very much, Lucknow Literary Festival, our society, for getting us together and giving us this wonderful opportunity to share our thoughts. Thank you very much, and hope to see you, Srinivas, at least soon enough.